Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly podcast in which we talk about all things Beatles, the past, the present, anything we feel like. And I'm Ken Michaels, one of the 4 regular co-hosts of this show. And you might know me from my other Beatles program, a syndicated radio show called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my 3 other regular co-hosts, that being the man who writes for Beatles Examiner, Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
Also, one of the writers for Beatle Fan Magazine, who's been with them since the very beginning, that being Al Sussman.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
Al's just coming right out of his car right now as we speak.
Ka-ching, ka-ching.
This is a very live show as we're recording it. Whatever we're doing in the moment,
middle
you
of the
can hear
street.
it.
That's right. There we go.
This is like Eric Idle with the Ruddles.
Right.
The man on the street there. And also we have our resident musicologist who writes for a number of different publications, and that includes Beatle Fan Magazine. That is Allan Kozin. Hi, Allan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
On the show this time out, we're going to be talking about a couple of, several news items that have happened in the past week or so. First of all, I thought we'd just very briefly mention, because we just found out today the very first report, although I must emphasize that it's unconfirmed, about Paul McCartney's latest batch of remasters coming out. We've heard for quite a while that they would be Tug of War and Pipes of Peace. Well, the first report I've seen now on the internet is that they'll be coming out on September the 18th. And I do want to emphasize that we don't have any official word about this. This is the first time that news with a date has actually leaked out. This is the initial announcement about it. And as we all know, since we've all covered Beatle news, dates have a way of changing as well. Things get postponed so many times. So all that we're saying is this is the first report, September 18th, for those 2 remastered CDs. Guys, you want to comment about that?
As far as the date itself goes, it's not necessarily the dates get changed. It's that sources are not always, especially in reports like this, are not always correct. So, I wouldn't put 100% trust in that, but we'll find out. Hopefully we'll get an announcement soon from Concord.
As Ken said, it's been reported for months that the next 2 archive releases are going to be Tug of War and Pipes of Peace, which make absolute sense, because those 2 albums, perhaps more than any 2 in Paul's whole post-Beatles catalog, are almost joined at the hip. Pipes of Peace is very much kind of a follow-up to Tug of War. Although, in the opinion of many, Tug of War is a much better album, and it certainly was much more successful. But it does totally make sense that they would come out together as archive releases.
Mm-hmm. Allan?
Yeah, I think so too, and I think that's one of the reasons that we've been hearing for so long that they would be released together. That plus maybe a certain amount of wishful thinking, because so many people like particularly Tug of War, and the Pipes of Peace is the logical companion for it. I guess what I wonder is whether, unlike any of the previous box sets, which were absolutely all self-contained, whether there'll be any kind of linkage between these 2, since they really do sort of go together so well.
Yeah. The songs from Pipes of Peace, many of them came from the Tug of War sessions anyway.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, how do you decide what bonus tracks belong on one album and one on the other?
Right.
So, it'll be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it was largely correct, that report, because it's been a while since the last couple of reissues, and, I think he does want to keep that program going. So you can't really wait a year between each reissue. He's got too many albums for that. None of us will sort of live through it.
Right.
It's very true.
And they did hint at it in the last one with the card. So the fact that these 2 albums have been next up is is no big scoop. It's just the fact that we haven't actually had dates before this. So.
Of course, he could just fake us out and put out Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway.
There we go.
Exactly.
That's true. That's true. He could.
Are there any clues as to what's going to be included? For instance, Wogblog sometimes uses guesswork, but a lot of times they are able to kind of scoop the kind of material that's going to be in the sets. At least the expanded, the deluxe versions.
I haven't heard.
I think the only way you could guess at that, and that's all you can do, is go back to whatever information about the sessions is there and see what possibilities exist, might exist. I don't think I don't think there's going to be any, until the official announcement, I don't think you're going to know. I really don't. I mean, blogs can guess all they want, but there's not going to be any solid information to go on. So.
And probably what a lot of people will be thinking, as I will, is that whatever has been bootlegged from those sessions, probably some of that will appear on here. So there's a lot of material, a lot of demos from Tug of War. I think those might find their way, although you never know with Paul.
Yeah.
There's some things.
The thing is, there's an awful lot of bootleg material from those two sessions, and for him to include most of it would mean a pretty big box set, which tends to be not what he does. What I kind of have liked about some of the previous ones is that in a lot of cases he's gone past the ones that we already have and put out things that we don't have, which is kind of a nice thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, my theory about bootlegs has always been that people who collect them are collecting them because they love the material so much and would be perfectly happy to buy a legitimate one. So if they put out simply legitimate versions of the stuff on bootleg, I wouldn't really have a problem with that. But the fact that we're getting stuff even beyond that, I think is really a good thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just recently with Venus and Mars to have those demos of 4th of July.
Right.
And It's Love. I mean, I never knew they even existed.
Right. Yeah, you'd think he's watching the bootleg market, the way he's been dealing with that. So
I think he's pretty well aware of what's out there on bootlegs. I mean, he's always said, for instance, that he was going to put out Cold Cuts and ended up canceling it because it had already come out on a boot anyway. I don't think he may be exaggerating or whatever, but I think he's aware of what's out there.
Mm-hmm. He could always put out Cold Cuts and put a different variation of it or tracks on there that haven't been bootlegged.
Right.
So, yeah.
Except weren't there 2 or 3 different versions of Cold Cuts?
Right.
And and each time, they would leak out, I guess he would say, okay, well, we won't do that. So let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And then he's gone on to release a lot of that stuff legitimately.
Yes, exactly.
As bonus tracks.
Yeah. Right.
Like Same Time Next Year, songs like those.
Yeah.
Mama's Little Girl. All right, why don't we talk very briefly about Ringo's big celebration in Los Angeles, which took place at the Capitol Records Tower for his 75th birthday. I know, Steve, you did a number of articles on this. There's so many incredible people that showed up there, some friends and family, as you would expect, but a few surprise things connected with this event as well.
Well, I guess the biggest surprise that I wrote about was the fact that it's now sponsored by American Airlines, and that was not mentioned in any of the advance information. So, I mean, that was really kind of a surprise that's happened. And you got to give, if that's the case, it's a great way to look forward to the event in the upcoming years. That opens up all sorts of possibilities. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
What does sponsored mean in this case?
That's a good question. Because there was no advance information that American Airlines had anything to do with this. Yeah, and when Ringo dropped that information on Chris Carter, there was no advance information on this at all. So we don't know, there's no There was
Yeah, I
nothing
mean, just because sponsorships usually mean that someone is paying some money to support whatever the endeavor is, if it's a game or a broadcast, whatever is sponsored by. But the peace and love thing is just everybody saying peace and love at noon on Ringo's birthday. I'm not sure what that costs and what the sponsorship needs to be.
Right.
You know?
I don't either. That's probably
maybe he was joking.
I should maybe
it's possible.
It's it was a pretty jovial phone call.
Yeah. Because in the background, during the ceremony, I didn't see any American Airlines logos or really any logos of any kind.
Well, maybe it's also an event because of all the people that he invited there, and the fact that there was a band that played Ringo's music.
Right.
So it wasn't just a couple of minutes saying peace and love and goodbye.
Yeah.
Joe Walsh had a little speech. Richard Lewis had a speech. Someone we always connect with Ringo.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
As well as somebody else who you immediately think of Ringo when you think of him, and that, of course, is Bud Cort, who was a guest there.
Yeah, I had to refresh my memory of who Bud Cort is. I'd forgotten about Harold and Maude.
He was at Harold and Maude.
Harold and Maude was part of Harold and Maude was filmed about 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now.
Really?
The part on the bridge. That bridge, which no longer exists, was very close to. It still exists. Obviously, they rebuilt it, but it's very close to where I am. And so that was kind of interesting. And of course, David, you didn't mention David Lynch.
Yep, him too.
Who has probably the second worst hairstyle in the world outside of Donald Trump.
Except at least I think David's is real.
Right. Yeah, having seen it close up, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
But I think the important thing is that Ringo keeps doing this every single year, and I wasn't even aware until it was just reported that this is the 10th year he's doing this.
Wow.
I mean,
really?
I've always felt like it's been the last, 4 or 5 years, but apparently it has been 10.
Years.
So, it tells you how important this thing is to him.
Yeah. Right. And,
You see, there was an Access Hollywood clip that actually seemed to allow Access Hollywood itself to take credit for this. I don't know if you saw it, but they brought out the clip from 10 years ago where they're saying to him, so what are you doing for your birthday? And he said, what do you mean, what am I doing? and they start talking, and he said, okay, how about this? Every year on my birthday at noon, everyone will say peace and love. So it really looks like the whole idea is actually happening at Access Hollywood, which maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But when they asked him the question about what he was doing, he actually did seem not to have any idea and to just be coming up with this at the spur of the moment.
Wow.
So it's kind of funny that something like that, so off the cuff, would have become a 10-year tradition for him.
Yeah.
Well, the press releases in advance did mention something about he was asked, what he was going to do, and the story did kind of fall somewhere like that, but it didn't say. I don't remember if it said Access Hollywood or not. I'd have to look it up and see. But apparently, I really doubt there was a whole lot of planning into something like this.
Right.
I mean, it just doesn't fit. As far as, it sounds like it was pretty off the cuff, and every year it generates all this advanced publicity, and people like me write about it, and it generates more advanced publicity, and and the LA Times covered it this year, and so.
And he's done it in a number of different cities, because more often than not, during this 10-year period, he's been on tour with the All-Star Band. So that one year it was in New York, of course, famously. 1 year in Nashville, 1 year in Chicago, I think.
One was in Germany.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And this year was also interesting because of the fact that there was the Ringo birthday celebration already planned at Capitol Records by Jerry Rubin, not the We're not talking about the old
No.
Chicago 7 guy, for
Right.
those of you that are older, like as old as me. But no,
He
this
was
is
long dead anyway.
Yeah.
Right. This is a guy, a Beatle fan in Los Angeles who organizes all these events at Capitol for all the Beatles' birthdays and things like that. And they had already announced this before Ringo even had announced his. And when they announced it, I went to Ringo's publicist and I said, is it possible that Ringo is going to do something there? And there was no answer. And then, of course, they announced that there was, and that just kind of sparked everything. And that, I mean, usually those events at Capitol Records go on with nothing. I mean, they're just basically a bunch of fans, and Chris Carter from Breakfast of the Beatles goes down there and they cut cake and they sing but this year it was very special. It was they had to, my understanding was they had to kind of separate, they didn't have access to the Star, at noon. They had to wait until 3:00 to have access to the Star while Ringo was there. But yeah, it was an interesting juxtaposition of two events on top of each other that had no connection, but they were both there to celebrate Ringo's birthday. So.
Yeah. Well, we should still, say to Ringo that, he should be applauded for doing this year after year. This is not just a fleeting thing for him. It's obviously something that's very important to him. And you're talking about social media. There was a page developed on Facebook, Peace and Love, as well as on Twitter, so fans can post their messages of peace and love and happy birthday, Ringo, and more fans got involved. So it became more of a big deal and an event.
Yeah.
And one thing you really have to make note of is that it has not gotten political. With Yoko, look at Ringo versus Yoko. I mean, Yoko is very much a peace activist, and Yoko is very political. Although Ringo has, I've seen quotes of Ringo being political in the past. This is not political. And, for whatever reason, and I guess he does that because, if it gets political, it gets, you bring a lot of other aspects to it.
Sure.
But it has not been political at all. It's stayed very apolitical. And I guess for that, you have to kind of give him a little credit for that, as making it, I mean, it's basically just a positive thing, to create some positive, a positive aura. And, that kind of stuff doesn't happen very often now.
Not these days. It's true.
No. So, in that respect, you have to give Ringo credit. And the other thing about, how great he looks. I mean, he doesn't like to talk about it, but it's becoming more and more, obvious that he looks so damn healthy.
He really does. When you consider that he's 75, he looks fabulous.
You have to give him a whole lot of credit. And, staying healthy at his age is staying healthy after 50 is not easy.
No, it's not.
So he's doing such a great job. And, he's, the, advice he gave Chris Carter about, working out and not eating large amounts and being a vegetarian and going to the gym. And, that's just a great advice. And, it's just fantastic that he's, especially given where he was, earlier in his life, he's doing a great job.
Yeah.
When
you see pictures of Ringo from the 70s, say like the second half of the 70s and much of the 80s, boy, there's a big difference.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Allan, did you talk to him back then?
No, I didn't talk to him till 1989, so he was already on the road to healthiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, now he has to talk about how well he looks because everybody's asking him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't voluntarily bring it up, but everybody's asking him now. So, and another thing that I think people like about Ringo with regard to how healthy he looks is that he doesn't preach to people how to live.
No.
He just tells people how he lives.
Yeah.
So, and like we just said, he's not going to voluntarily talk about this. You really have to bring it up to him.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, no meat-free Mondays with Ringo.
Right.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Although I bet he does it, but I mean, yeah, you're
Could
absolutely
be,
right.
but he just doesn't make an event out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on to another topic, and that is that Paul McCartney gave an interview to Esquire magazine in the last week or so, and it got a lot of attention, especially, surprisingly, on Ringo's birthday. I saw it being mentioned quite a lot in the media. In fact, they even talked about it on CNN. And there was a number of topics that were brought up in this interview, but one of them which got the most attention was about how John is being made to be a martyr now. So I thought that I would read his quote about that. Let me get it out here. He says, when John got shot, aside from the pure horror of it, the lingering thing was, okay, well, now John's a martyr, a JFK. So what happened was, I started to get frustrated because people started to say, well, he was the Beatles. And me, George, and Ringo would go, hang on. It's only a year ago we were all equal-ish. Yeah, John was the witty one, sure. John did a lot of great work, yeah. And post-Beatles, he did more great work, but he also did a lot of not great work. Now the fact that he's now martyred has elevated him to a James Dean and beyond. So whilst I didn't mind that, I agreed with it, I understood that now there was going to be revisionism. It was going to be John was the one. That's the end of the quote there. So this is a subject that Paul has brought up before.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily shock me that he's saying this. But I have noticed just in general, not in just this interview, but other ones, as he's gotten older, he's getting more candid. He's being a bit more revealing about himself. Maybe not as much as a lot of people would hope, but he is opening up a lot more about his feelings. And evidently this is still something that is bothering him. So how do you guys feel about Paul's comments there about John the Martyr? How about we'll start with Allan?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand where he's coming from there, and I can see how, from his perspective, that can be a little irritating, but he is also ignoring the fact that in 1970 there were people saying John was the Beatles and John was still, alive. I think that possibly his having got shot made it, put it in higher relief, because obviously there were going to be all the specials about him. And I mean, it's simply the way the media works and the way people think. Someone dies, then you focus on aspects of their career. But really, I mean, there have always been partisans, really, for all of them, I think probably, but certainly between John and Paul. I mean, we've talked about this before, that at the time of the breakup, people were really kind of divided between whether John was the real force of the Beatles or whether Paul was, and whose solo work at the very beginning was better and whose wasn't. And so, so it's a battle he's been fighting for an awful long time. He just now has more of a focus for it, and I suppose what's the alternative? I mean, if, God forbid he'd have been shot. I mean, what would he prefer, having been shot and become the martyr, or having to survive and live through the other guy being called the martyr? I'm not sure if he was shot whether he would be called the people would have been saying that he was the Beatles. I don't know.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think if the same thing had happened to him, there'd be a lot of people saying, where would we be without Hey Jude?
And Yesterday.
Where would we be without Yesterday, Let It Be, the really iconic songs, Eleanor Rigby, those songs that Paul's so well identified with.
Right.
When somebody dies, and especially it's magnified times 100 if you die young, then you really concentrate on that person's contributions more so than the others.
Right.
And I think that Paul, to his credit, has tried very much to try to get the public to think the Beatles were a collaboration. It was the four of them. Mm-hmm. And I always remember when Paul was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 5 years after John, which was an insult, as soon as he got inducted, he said, come on, guys, George and Ringo are next. So he wanted all four of them to be recognized for their contributions. He never said the Beatles were John Lennon and the Beatles or Paul McCartney and the Beatles. The Beatles were John, Paul, George, and Ringo. It was the four of them together, and they all made massive contributions to the group. And so it's understandable how this can really irk him. And all these years later, it still evidently bothers him.
Right.
So instead of being comfortable with what he's achieved, and I'm sure many of us would say, lighten up already. We know what you've done. We know what John's done. You can't tell him how to feel because he was one of them, and he's observing this all these years.
Sure.
So, he is human, which sometimes people forget. So, anybody else out?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I found, and I was looking through Keith Badman's Off the Record 2 today, and I found an interesting, this is from 81, which obviously is after John's passing, but he's talking about Philip Norman's book, and he said, and I'm not going to read the whole passage because this is very long, but I'll read a couple of parts of it. He says, I hated Shout for the way I am portrayed in it. The contrast between myself and John, so assiduously cultivated by journalists, was fabrication. I wasn't brilliant at school. I was troubled just like John. I got caned practically every day, and the only exam I passed was Spanish. But then further down in the same quote, he says, what the book says about me being the great manipulator simply isn't true. Nothing happened in the Beatles unless everyone wanted it to happen, but when there was a decision to be made, somebody had to say it out loud, and that usually turned out to be my job. I accepted it. And I read that, and I read what he just said there, and I think, I think you can put some weight on things that he says now, but I think you have to kind of look at it, you have to kind of not take it real seriously, because I think, depending on the time and the, and the circumstances, he's going to say different things. That we all know how he's changed stories. I don't know what to say there as far as, I mean, I just don't take that very seriously. I don't take either one very seriously, really, because he just says what he wants to say. He's always been so public relations oriented. So, Guy, anybody want to say anything about that?
Well, you have to consider that the Lennon was a martyr comment came late in a fairly long discussion about first the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership and why it was Lennon-McCartney and not McCartney-Lennon, and then the relationship with Yoko and various and sundry other things, and then you come to the to the point where after John was killed, and of course this is something that as Ken mentioned that Paul has mentioned in the past. I guess it was probably about 82 that he made a mention of John in again an out of context quote in an interview as Martin Luther Lennon. And so obviously this is something that has bugged him for a long time. Just the mere fact that you've got those, Steve, that you've got those quotes there from 81, so soon after, not only so soon after John's murder, but also so soon after the Philip Norman book itself came out. So obviously this is something that is kind of a burr in his saddle for a long time. And so even though he's, he and Yoko have a much better relationship than they once had and all, still he has, the relationship, at least publicly, the public relationship, between John and Paul still bothers him. No question about that.
And seemingly the comments that Yoko periodically made,
yes,
he quotes her in this one as saying, well, John was the Beatles, Paul just booked the studio. I mean, I can see how if you're Paul, that would really bother you. And there have been other times too where she said, John was Mozart and Paul was Salieri, and I don't know, I have no idea why she does these things, but and possibly he should just ignore them, but you can see how they obviously bother him, and he feels periodically in interviews that they need to be addressed.
Yeah. I mean, even fairly recently, she made a comment about Ringo, that Ringo was I forget whether it was the most popular of the four or what, but was that it?
Yeah, she did say that.
And I'm sure that went over real well with Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's something else that I'd like to bring up here, and I think this is really important because a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the Beatles were so unique as a band.
Sure.
I mean, how many bands out there can you say had four members where you had two main songwriters, a third songwriter who still wrote quite a lot, and even the fourth member wrote a couple of songs in there.
Right.
And then as musicians, they all contributed so much to each other's songs. And a lot of people want everything to have a simple explanation as to what the Beatles were. And it's not that simple, because all four of them made such big contributions to their music, and still to this day, we don't know everything about them. And we're never going to know everything about them. It's like I brought it up many times here on this show when we saw the documentary of Living in the Material World, and Paul brought up And I Love Her, and George wrote the guitar part, the four notes, and I had never heard that before. So you're always learning new things about what the Beatles contributed to each other's music. It isn't just as simple as that's a Lennon song, that's a McCartney song. True, you could say that in the majority of songs the Beatles did as a group, whatever song John sang lead to was mainly his song. Whatever song Paul sang lead to was mainly his song. But how do you know the other guy didn't make some big contribution to the song in some way?
Yeah.
Whether it's changing one line, whether it's approving a line, like the movement you need is on your shoulders.
Right.
I mean, John Lennon didn't write that line, but that song might have been changed had he not approved it.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that each of the four of them made contributions to the band. And I'm saying this only because I see so many instances online where people say the stupidest things about the Beatles that are completely inaccurate. And they don't know. And I think Paul is very concerned about the way the story of the Beatles is brought out to the public, whether it is accurate or not. And that's why he wrote a song like Early Days.
Yeah.
He talked about this young girl who came up to him and said she was taking a class on the Beatles, and Paul told her some story about something that happened with them, and she said to him, no, that's not the way it happened. I mean, when you're reaching a point where the fans think they know more than they do, give it up already. You know what I'm saying? Because it's one thing to be a historian, and it's great to study all this stuff, but we're never going to know as much as those four guys knew. They lived it. And the whole process of what the Beatles did creatively and what their relationships were is so complicated that we'll never know everything.
No.
And there are fans out there that think they know everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I see it all the time online. And Paul even made the comment here about when you buy a Beatles song on iTunes, they have limited space on the screen. So sometimes all you see is John Lennon ... on the song. Well, how do you know someone who's young, who hasn't learned anything about the Beatles, is likely to think, oh, that's a John song?
Yeah.
Not everybody is educated and knows everything about the Beatles. It takes a lot to learn everything about the Beatles. So I understand his frustration in all this.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very, very much so. Although Mark Lewison, who certainly does know, a goodly amount,
Absolutely.
even he has said that he thought that, early days, I think his quote was that Paul was having a go at him because I guess he, maybe was somewhat self-conscious about, whether Paul thinks that, Mark is sort of making himself out to be the ultimate authority on the Beatles, although, of course, the amount of research that he's done is mind-bogglingly magnificent.
It's staggering.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if Mark would ever say, I know more about the Beatles than Paul McCartney.
No, definitely not. Definitely.
He's probably the last person that would say that.
Exactly. Right. Whereas, that shows you just how much ignorance goes on these, on social media. which I'm getting more and more and more disgusted with, because there is all of this, these people, they have the, they can make whatever comments they want, no matter how stupid they are. And, nobody's going to check them on it unless they confront them, and then it degenerates into, into a pissing match.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's, I unless they're people who I know as being authorities, or at least being very knowledgeable, I take most of what I see online about the Beatles with about a couple of shakers full of salt.
Yeah.
I think you can extend that beyond the Beatles, I'll tell you.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, please.
And the sad thing is that once you post something online, people read it and are influenced by it.
Very true.
And some people automatically believe it,
instead
of doing the research and trying to learn more themselves. So, I understand why he's upset, because the majority of bands that we've had in the history of popular music have usually one lead singer, maybe one or two songwriters. It's not as complicated as the Beatles. And I'm not saying that other bands don't have each member adding something to the group and contributing, but the Beatles in every single way added so much to each other's music.
Oh, yeah.
So, unless you understand that, and a lot of fans don't,
right.
So I understand what it's like to really support the songwriter because he wrote the song, and definitely I'll always associate the song with the songwriter first.
Mm-hmm.
But the Beatles brought so much to each other's songs in many ways, and to be a real fan and to appreciate them, you have to study that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And to single out John for his great contributions, and there's no doubt he made so many of them, you can't discount the other three.
Yeah. I can remember back in the 70s there was a phrase that went around that said that when it came to the Beatles, the sum of the whole did not equal the whole itself. Meaning people who felt that the post Beatles recordings, and I know there's going to be disagreement here, but that the quality of the post Beatles work of the individual Beatles was not up to the quality of the group's work.
Mm-hmm.
So the sum of the whole does not equal the whole itself.
Well, that's another show
yes,
for us.
Indeed.
Because that's where I would disagree.
Right.
But, it's such a long conversation to have on that particular topic. But, that's why I understand where Paul's coming from here.
Right.
So, The other thing he did comment on, among other things, was that he did feel that probably there will never be another band that will have the same impact as the Beatles. So, and that's a topic that we can certainly do an entire show on whether or not we feel that could ever happen again. So, it's definitely a very interesting interview. As I said, I think that Paul is loosening up a bit more and saying how he feels. That's the one thing he said there about with John's solo music, that he did some great work and not so great work. Mm-hmm. I'd love to know what he thought was his great work and not so great work. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that I often wish about all four of the Beatles was that they would have commented more about their own solo work and the other three's solo work and what they thought was their best. And you only have a few, really, just, a few slight examples here and there where one of them will say, like George liked I'm Carrying Paul's song, or That Would Be Something, or that Paul liked Beautiful Boy. There's like a few isolated examples here and there. But I'd love to know Paul's thoughts about not only his own music, but the other three Beatles solo music.
Plus the fact that, John's post-Beatles career, of course, was so tragically short, and the majority of it was in the first half of the 70s, which was during that period when they were very much on the outs with each other. So it stands to reason that Paul probably would not have had much positive or negative to say about John's work at that point. Because
that depends on whether or not he associates his relationship with him with the music, which really is a separate thing.
Well, yeah. Plus the fact that at that point he was really so busy trying to push Wings and, really didn't comment very much on anything other than, his own music or the group. He really didn't, and even Beatles comments were kind of short and, get them out of the way, so he really didn't make much in the way of comments at that time about really any of the others.
Yeah, but I'm just saying in general, all these years, even to this, they rarely do talk about each other's solo music. And when George was alive, he didn't do that.
Yeah.
So, I wish I knew their thoughts of what they felt was, their strongest work and not so strong work. I love seeing, a few years ago, there was a DVD that came out on the Plastic Ono Band, and you had Yoko in there, and Klaus Voormann, and Ringo was talking about how much he loved being a part of that album, and some of his drumming he loved. He thought that it was amongst his strongest on certain songs. I love hearing that. So I just wish that there was more of that.
Well, plus in Paul's case, I think he may not have been doing all that much listening to the others' catalogs because, for instance, in 2002, when he appeared at the concert for George, and I think Eric Clapton talks about this in one of the two versions of the film, that when Paul came to the rehearsals and it was decided that he was going to do the song "All Things Must Pass," at least according to Clapton, it seemed to him that Paul was really not all that familiar with the song at all. Even though the Beatles had performed it, not performed it, but they had played it during the Twickenham rehearsals for the Get Back album. It seemed that Paul really didn't know that song very well at all. And in fact, even when they performed it at the concert for George, at the very end of it, you can see Paul kind of take a backward glance at Eric as if to say, "Did I do it okay?" So he may not have been doing all that much listening to the others' music.
That really is shocking to me. I mean, I can't imagine all four of them not following each other's music, regardless of what their relationships were like at that moment. So, there are some people who think they were watching over each other's shoulders.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't the case.
Yeah, apparently not.
Anyway, I thought that we'd bring up this whole idea of something that we discussed several shows back, which is this idea that Paul, speaking of revisionism, Paul is a revisionist, and I know I asked Al to come up with a few examples of what he thinks of Paul revising history, and I thought we'd bring up those points here and hear what each of us have to say, because we only very quickly mention it in the show when we first talked about this, and I do want to defend Paul, and I guess in all instances. But the first one would be when Paul has said that the Beatles swore they wouldn't come to America until they had their first #1 hit. And I guess you'll remember, Al, going back to when I had my show on WDHA,
Sure.
I even brought this up, and I was ripping him apart for saying that, because I thought exactly what you're thinking. He didn't actually say we wouldn't go on Ed Sullivan or he wouldn't go on American television. What I think Paul really meant to say, and it's all in the way that it's worded, is that the Beatles wouldn't tour America until they had a #1. Because when he has explained this before, and you can actually listen to this in the McCartney interview album that came out in 1980, he would often bring up the example, and he has brought this up a few times, of Cliff Richard.
Right.
Was the biggest name in England. He was their Elvis Presley. And someone like a Cliff Richard would come to America, they'd be like 5th on the bill on a tour, and they wouldn't have any impact or make any splash at all. And the Beatles didn't want that. They wanted to come to America at a time when they had a big hit. They had a #1 hit. So I think what Paul really meant to say was that the Beatles wouldn't tour until they had a number one. It's all the way that he worded this. In fact, I even went back, because I know I brought this up before, but I listened back to an interview that I did with Mark Lewison. This is before all those years came out.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought up this very same topic. And he agreed with me that he thought that that's really what Paul meant. It just wasn't worded properly. It sounded kind of awkward. It sounded kind of cocky in a way, because it's very easy to misinterpret that as if to say, oh, we wouldn't come to America like Beyond Ed Sullivan unless we had a number one. I really think that he meant that they wouldn't tour the States.
Well, in fact, in probably the first book that really showed the Beatles as being, really human and not just, teen idols, the book called Love Me Do by Michael Braun, who toured with the Beatles in the fall of '63 in England, and then again in Paris in January of '64, and then when they came to America. In a conversation from the fall of '63, Paul was talking about Cliff Richard and talking about how, when George was in St. Louis in September, he had seen Summer Holiday, which was one of Cliff's big films in England, playing second bill on a double feature at a drive-in. And Paul said, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but basically said, I don't know if America really needs us. I'm not sure how well we'll actually make it in America. This is probably in October, November of '63. The only problem that I have is that in the film that is supposed to be kind of the Beatles on record about their story, with the anthology, Paul says basically the same thing, that he'd been saying in some of these interviews, that we were determined that we weren't going to come to America until we had a number one hit. So, maybe it's just the way he words it, but you would think that particularly for that, kind of on the record statement, he would have maybe parsed his words a little better.
Yeah. And unfortunately, if he's brought this up in an interview, nobody counters him with it.
Yeah.
So we're not going to know exactly what he meant by saying.
That's true, because most of the interviewers, they don't, they're clueless.
Allan, how do you feel about this?
I mean, I actually always had sort of thought that was a strange comment to make, and also the way that in the anthology they juxtaposed it with George saying, it was handy that we had a number one hit because we were booked to go there anyway.
Right.
But your explanation, which I hadn't really heard before, sounds sensible. I mean, it's very possible that he simply wasn't speaking as precisely as he should, and that he really meant come to America on tour. I can accept that. It just sounds the way he did put it. And he does know the language. Yeah. The way he did put it, it does make it sound like, we just weren't going to go there at all until we had a number one hit. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I guess it's a question of interpretation. As you say, we'll never really know what he actually meant, but,
unless somebody asks him directly.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Steve, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, we've had so many instances of Paul saying things and not knowing, being different, later on. I always take whatever he says with a grain of salt, even interviews, like this. I don't think there's no definitive word as far as I'm concerned with him. So, yeah.
Well, I don't think he changes his opinions that often. I think he's been consistent with this.
I still, there's been so many, as you guys say, interpretations and so many different, it seems like, depending on the circumstances, again, like I said earlier, I mean, he'll say one thing and then turn around and say another. I really don't take much of, what he said seriously. I mean, and the song on New is just another interpretation, really. So.
All right. Well, certainly that's the way that I feel about what that particular comment was. So, why don't we do another one? This is one that Al brought up as well when Paul has discussed Back to the Egg, which I really think, his comments weren't that big of a deal anyway, but often he'll say that, certain albums that we thought didn't do that well. We look and we saw that it went to number 8.
Right.
But I think that, whereas there are a lot of artists out there that would kill to have a number 8 album, probably what I'm thinking is that when Back to the Egg came out overall, in terms of sales, it was a disappointment. And certainly the people at CBS thought that way.
Yeah.
And, Paul was used to having number 1 albums. Mm-hmm. And even London Town, which went to number 2, I'm sure to some people, maybe even to Paul, was a disappointment. When you're used to having number 1s and for some reason you start to slip, he's probably reacting to the initial success or lack of that album. So that's just why I think he said what he said. I didn't think he meant to put down Back to the Egg. But that's just my thoughts about that. It's kind of like, I want to make a parallel here because I just recently saw the movie Love and Mercy.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought I thought in many ways was a great movie.
It is.
Not perfect, but the acting in that movie is just superb.
Yeah.
But they do reenact the Pet Sounds sessions, and one of the members of the group, I'm trying to remember if it was Mike Love or not, was reacting to the fact that Pet Sounds hadn't sold that well.
It was Mike.
Initially.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, obviously now it's looked at as being a masterpiece, but when it first came out, it didn't do that well, and I'm sure that in the eyes of the group, it was a disappointment. So to think of it that way, it's just, Paul's remembering that the album didn't do that well.
Yeah.
So that's probably why he said what he said. I don't think he was trying to really cut down the album.
Although in the case of Pet Sounds, it did reach the top 10.
Right.
And of course in England it was absolutely massive.
Mm-hmm.
But that's true. And obviously not only Mike Love's interpretation, but also Capitol Records, who about a month after Pet Sounds came out, put out a hastily assembled Best of the Beach Boys album to try to make up the sales that they felt they had lost from Pet Sounds. So it's,
right.
I guess everything's relative. Yeah, it is strange that even an album like London Town, which was, as you said, a number 2 album. Yeah, I think Paul also may consider that to be a disappointment because, for instance, with A Little Luck, which was a number 1 record, right?
Right.
He's never performed in the entirety of his live career. He's never performed that song.
Well, when Wings toured in '79, the UK tour, I know that Paul did say that he rehearsed the song and it just didn't work out well. So he did perform I've Had Enough from London Town.
Yeah.
So it's not like he was completely dismissing that album.
Right.
So, yeah. But, London Town would have been a number 1 album if it wasn't for Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah, that's true.
So, it was still a successful album by most accounts, but, where Back to the Egg is concerned, it's probably Paul's remembering his initial reaction to the album not doing as well as he and they wanted it to. So.
Yeah, that's true. But, and again, even there, it was a top 10 album. So,
right.
So, to kind of slough it off as a mistake, although I don't think he's actually referred to it as a mistake, but he's kind of disowned it over the years. Certainly in comparison to his, the albums from earlier in the 70s, especially the mid 70s Wings albums.
All right. Anybody else want to comment on this? I guess not.
I guess not.
All right. And finally, the last bit of revisionism, if you want to call it that, that's why we're debating this, all concerns the song Blackbird.
Right.
And, we've talked about this before, and I remember when Paul started saying in concert that this was a song that he wrote to reflect upon all the problems going on in America, you know, the racial problem, and he wanted to write a song for women. And when I heard Blackbird growing up my whole life, I thought it was about a bird flying away.
Yeah.
It's become now this symbol of freedom for black people, or I don't know, black women, black people. So the question remains, do we think that when Paul wrote this song, that was his original intent? And we had a couple of people writing in, including our regular listener, Michael Lynch. And I'm going to read an email from another listener, Andy Fitzsimmons, who wrote in, "Hi, Ken, I really enjoy things we said today, but I was very surprised to hear the discussion about Paul revising the meaning of Blackbird. Contrary to what your co-host said, Paul did indeed tell Donovan in 1968 the song was inspired by race riots in America. This can be heard on a currently up YouTube clip, Paul McCartney and Donovan, 1968-69, at about the 4-minute mark. Paul jokes about Diana Ross not liking the song, then says immediately after that joke that it was indeed inspired by black race riots, to the surprise of Donovan, who thought it was just about birds and their color. I don't know whether the first thick Liverpool English accents made this confusing, but Paul is saying..."
Great reaction.
But Paul is saying contemporaneously and privately that the song was inspired by civil rights. He has not revised the meaning of the song at all. It is fascinating to me that Paul's songs can be so subtle in their meaning that everyone, including me, can have no idea what they are actually about, and then when he publicly reveals their meaning in many years from now, he can be accused of making it up to appear more serious. Luckily, there is a bootleg showing that was the case, but it makes you think about people who are so suspicious of Paul's explanations. I loved the song when I thought it was just about a blackbird, but I have a deeper appreciation knowing what it was inspired by. Okay?
Yeah,
so what do you guys think about that letter?
Well, just one little thing about that is that the night after the shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, Paul played in Greensboro. I think that was the night that Rick Glover came on stage. And yet when Paul did Blackbird, there was no mention of what had happened the night before. And you would have thought that, you know, especially in that part of the country, unless he was like totally, you know, totally ignorant of what had happened, it's possible because he is fairly sheltered. So he might not have heard about the reports of the shooting, but it just seemed a little weird that he didn't make at least some comment. Now, I think the next night he did, I'm trying to remember now, Steve may remember, he did make a dedication, I think, at the next concert afterward, which was also in the South.
Yeah,
but
right, I'd have to look it up, but yeah, he did.
Exactly.
You're right, he did.
Right.
He did.
He did it at South Carolina, and he did it before that at the Firefly Festival.
Right. Yeah. Well,
in Dover.
I mean, he does it now in almost every concert. He does Blackbird.
No, I'm talking about dedicating the Long and Winding Road.
Oh, yes. Yes, you're right. Yes. That's true. That's very true. But it just seemed weird that the night after this, you know, fairly devastating event, that there was no reference to it in a song before he performed a song which is supposedly about the civil rights movement.
I don't know. Maybe you're making too much of that.
It's very possible. I may be reading entirely too much into it, but you know, that's it just piqued my interest. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Allan, how do you feel about this?
Well, I'm familiar with the recording that he mentions, and I'm familiar with the part where he plays Blackbird and then jokes that Diana Ross was offended about it. I don't recall hearing the hearing him saying that it actually was inspired by civil rights. But I mean, I have it. I'll listen to it again, and maybe it's there. I'm not doubting his word. If he's heard that, maybe it was mumbled and I just didn't catch it or whatever. But I've listened to that recording a number of times, and I don't recall hearing that part. It would be interesting if that's the case, if he actually does say directly that that's what it was, and in that case, I take it all back.
Right.
How about you, Steve?
I've always had trouble taking that seriously, that song actually had any connection to civil rights at all. It just doesn't make sense that it would. I mean, the lyrics are. I mean, it's such a beautiful song, and not to say that you can't write beautiful songs about civil rights, but the words and everything just don't have any connection as far as I'm concerned. As far as I can. You don't
think that the lyrics about a blackbird, taking their broken wings, learning to fly, that could be a metaphor for black people having freedom?
I suppose it could, but it's not something he. I mean, he never mentioned it until we heard it, until he started talking about it in concert. I mean, it was never something, except for the Donovan clip, assuming that is what he said there. But it's just having not heard that, or having him not say that over the years, it's just hard to, I don't know.
This is something that, and even Michael Lynch brought this up to me, and we've spoken about this. What makes everybody think that we know everything there is to know about the whole Beatles catalog? I know so much has been written about it, but there's still the possibility that there's things to learn. I mean, when a year ago, Paul said that he helped write Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, some fans were up in arms about that. And Paul didn't say he wrote half of it. He might have written one line in it. A lot of it was taken from the circus poster. But the minute that Paul says anything new about any of this music, it's very possible that no one ever asked him about Blackbird. So it never came up in conversation. There's still quite a lot that we can learn about any of their songs. So it just seems like a lot of fans seem to think that everything's been written about the Beatles that could be written, although I'm sure with Mark Lewison's work that's going to be proven to be very wrong.
Already has.
Right.
Yeah. So, but there's still plenty to learn about this music, and it's very likely that we don't know everything, and we'll probably never know everything.
I understand that completely. It's just that it doesn't make logical sense given the words, given the whole atmosphere of the song, that it has anything to do with that. I mean, it just doesn't. I just don't get. It's not that I don't get the connection. It's just that the disconnect between when the song came out and now, and not having, or recently, and not having said anything for so long. It's not something that you're going to sit there and go, oh yeah, that's right. I mean, if obviously if that's what he says, that's what he says. I mean, but it's just, I'm just saying that. As you were saying, it caught everybody by surprise. I mean, when people, when he started saying that, they were going, really? So, mm-hmm. I mean, it's just one of those things. I mean.
Plus, he began performing it in 75, 76 with Wings. And
right.
In the, pretty much the standard patter of the show, made no reference to that at all.
Right.
He just did the song. And I'm not sure exactly when it was that he began talking about the song being about civil rights.
It seems to me it was like 10 years ago,
I think it's longer.
I think it was
than
more
that
longer than that, but
think so?
I'm not sure, exactly when.
But you would think if that was the case, if he was performing it with Wings, that would have been the time to mention it, because there was so much civil rights activism going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't know. Paul didn't say all that much in concert.
No, that's true. And during '76, he really did not talk very much in those shows. Certainly
No.
not to the extent that he does now.
Yeah.
No, true.
So, it was more, are you having a good time?
Yeah, right, that kind of
You
thing.
ready to rock and roll?
Right.
All that. That's basically what he says in concert. He gets the crowd working up, That's what he does in concert. He doesn't give these great speeches. He's prepared more stuff in recent years, and they usually tends to be a formula, that it's the same speech almost every single time with not much variation.
In fact, somebody brought up very recently that he seems to be talking more and more that it's his shows are almost becoming like storyteller shows, because he seems to have a story for every song.
Well, I wouldn't say every song.
No, not every song, but a lot. He does talk about a lot of them now.
Well, he's opened up a bit more.
Yeah.
Like I said, not only in his interviews, but on stage. He's a little bit looser now. So, but usually everything has always been very controlled with him, in concert. So, there's nothing that says that he had to have said this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago for it to be true. Mm-hmm. If he feels like talking about it now, there may be information about a Beatles song that he brings up later on that we never knew. Mm-hmm. So that's just the way it is. If he's not confronted on specific songs, if it's just him voluntarily bringing it up, that's up to him to decide when he wants to.
And I think what gets some people upset is those people are generally Lennon fans, and they feel that, well, John's not here to defend himself and say whether or not Paul had anything to do with the writing of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite.
Right.
Paul's taking on that role, even though, because John's not here anymore, that kind of thing.
All right. Well, that pretty much brings the show to a close. Before we end the show, we do have a brand new Twitter account. So, Steve, you want to tell the folks about that?
Yes, it's if you want to follow us on Twitter, it's the @sign, the usual Twitter sign, and it's Things We Said Fab. So there you go.
Okay. And we still have our Facebook page at Things We Said Today, so please like us there. And we have our own email account, which is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. I want to invite all of our listeners to write to us here and comment about anything they like, any of the topics that we've done past, or maybe this show. Maybe there's something you want to tell us about or share about our feelings about this revisionism topic with Paul McCartney. And again, our email is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com.
Also, we've gotten a couple of, as you know, Ken, we've gotten some nice comments about the 65 show from last week.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So Andrew Grant Jackson was a great guest, and hopefully we'll have him on again on another show. He did write another book on the solo Beatles, which you should explore, called Still the Greatest, the essential songs of the Beatles' solo careers. So we thank everyone for their comments about that show. And I want to invite people to my website at kenmichaelsradio.com. Speaking of Andrew Grant Jackson, there's a new interview I just did with him talking about the solo careers of the Beatles, which you can find on the website. All right. Anybody else want to add anything where fans can contact you?
They can contact me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com.
Okay.
And
Al?
I'm on Facebook at Al Sussman, on Twitter at ASUSS49, and the 1965 series, continue that every day. And generally, if you come on around midday, you'll see, whatever today's entry is.
Okay. And Allan?
On Facebook at Allan Kozin or Allan Kozin Remixed, and on Twitter at @Kozin.
All right, then. So on behalf of Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, and Allan Kozin, I'm Ken Michaels, thanking all of you for listening, and we'll see you next time.